Hello, I'm Luke Radel. I'm here in the heart of downtown Utica, New York, where less than 2 years ago, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, you may have heard of him, he came here in hopes of keeping NY-22 a Republican seat.
The President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.
You know, I'm here for Claudia.
But on election night, things turned out a little differently.
Let's go to Washington, D.C.
Congresswoman Claudia Tenney has broken her silence and conceded the race for New York's 22nd Congressional District.
Tenney telling us in a statement, as the votes have been counted in the last several weeks, it's been clear that while we remain on the right side of the issues in history, we came out on the wrong side of a very close race.
Democratic Congressman-elect Anthony Berdussi is the winner in that district that covers all or part of 8 counties in upstate New York.
Now, Republican voters are looking to take back the House right here in NY-22, and tonight, they're the ones asking the questions. We're honored to have tonight for this voter forum congressional candidate George Phillips, who's running in the Republican primary on June 23rd, to answer the questions submitted by you, the voters. Mr. Phillips, thank you so much for joining us for this forum.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So I want to get right to the voter questions, but I'll start with this one. This event was supposed to be a debate between you and your primary opponent, Claudia Tenney. As you can see, though, she is not here. What message do you think her absence sends to NY-22 Republicans?
It's a huge message. As I've said in my releases, as I've said to you as well, the debate was not about me or Claudia Tenney. It's about the process. It's about the republic. It's about the voters. Voters deserve to hear a debate between two candidates for office, for any office, but especially a major race like this. This is the #1 race in the country. This is a district President Trump won by 15 points. Super PACs have already purchased $4 million in advertising for the fall. And for her not to debate, it really is insulting to the voters. This is from the same member of Congress who, in her first 9 months in office, wouldn't hold a town hall meeting and has been deemed not accessible for the voters. So this just reinforces that image. I've done 10,000 doors. I've done thousands of phone calls. I've been accessible. She hasn't. And I think it fits in our favor. Issues aside, parties aside, politics aside, people in congressional districts, voters, want people who are accessible, want politicians who respond. I might not always agree with every constituent. They might not agree with my positions, but I'm going to respond. I'm going to be there. I'm going to answer tough questions.
Speaking of some tough questions, we're going to get to some voter questions now. At the forefront of many Americans' minds right now is the coronavirus pandemic. As this is airing, the president is holding a 19,000-person rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His first since the viral outbreak claimed more than 100,000 lives. A question from a voter in Herkimer County: do you feel that the Trump administration has taken and is taking this virus seriously enough?
I think they absolutely are. We obviously saw a very serious situation in Italy. We had states making shutdown orders. I think New York State has stayed shut down way too long, especially upstate. So I think we went way too far in many cases, even though there was a huge crisis in New York City. We could have been more targeted. 90% of counties in this country did not have a coronavirus epidemic or pandemic in terms of the numbers. Secure the nursing homes, secure the elderly. We have to practice social distancing and safe guidelines here going forward. I think the Trump administration has taken it seriously, but they also realize the negative impact the shutdown of the economy has had on health. A lot of people not being able to make routine doctor office checks that could prevent the things, therapies, follow-ups, people getting depressed for losing their jobs. Unfortunately, you hate to even mention it, but suicide rates skyrocketing. So a very sad time. I think they have taken it seriously. We have to get back to life here. I think that's the message they're sending us, and we have to continue to protect the vulnerable and elderly, though.
A follow-up on that question, how are you going to move forward with your campaigning in a safe way as this election continues?
Yeah, we're still keeping social distancing guidelines. We haven't been doing door-to-door, but we're going to be out there. We're going to be accessible. I hope that I'm the nominee in the fall and we can have town hall meetings and debates, and we'll take the guidelines. You know, as we've seen, public gatherings are going on now. Graduations are going on. There's limits to how many people could be there. I'd like to think that we'd have more than 150 people at a congressional debate, but I don't know that we're that important. So I think we could definitely have these events in the fall, and that's exciting news for the voters. It will give them more access.
A question from a voter in Oneida County. She asks, what measures would you take to limit the influence of China in the political and economic spheres of our society?
I've worked on China for a long time as a congressional aide to the vice chairman of the House International Relations Committee. We battled on human rights in China, and I think that's one of the things that's missing in this debate. We know we've had unfair trade practices. We know they've stolen intellectual property. We know it's caused part of the crisis, having our medical supplies in China. At the heart of this is a corrupt regime, is a regime that abuses human rights, that puts people who speak out against it in prison, and puts religious leaders in prison as well, and suppresses religious freedom. We need to speak out, and I'm going to speak out as a member of Congress on those issues. As you start to get those issues going, then everything else falls in place. Yes, why are we cutting the brakes with trade? Yes, we need to set the record straight on the trade imbalance. We need to have our critical supplies made here, but we need to shine the spotlight on China's horrid human rights record.
On that question, there is some breaking news. We're reporting this on Thursday morning. I want to follow up by asking you about some of the first-hand accounts from the president's former national security advisor, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton says that President Trump pleaded with China's Xi Jinping to assist him in winning this year's election. He also said that the president was willing to, quote, look the other way on China's human rights violations in concentration camps. Should the president be asking foreign countries to help him in his campaigns?
Well, certainly not, but at the same time, I'd like to read Bolton's statements. I'd like to hear a response of the president and his administration. This is what I'm getting right now is second or third hand information. So I'd like to have all the facts, and obviously what's going on in international policy is going to impact elections here. So trying to keep a vigorous U.S. economy is certainly something that would be in any president's benefit. Whether in economic relations between countries may impact that. So what actually was said, I wasn't there. It's obviously Mr. Bolton has put out some things that I've just heard from you. I'd like to see the full conversation in the Trump response before I issue a full comment.
Absolutely. You said of Congressman Brindisi's vote in favor of impeachment that it was, quote, a travesty to justice and to the Constitution of the United States. A voter in Madison County asked, what do you think was Brindisi's biggest mistake in Congress? Do you think it's impeachment?
I think it was, and that was a vote that, as most people looked at it objectively, would say, look, he wasn't going to be removed from office because it was a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate. They weren't going to be able to get that threshold. This was political. This was partisan. It wasted 6 months of hearings. There wasn't due process followed for the president. Even if you don't like him, even if you think what he did was inappropriate with the call to Ukraine, did it rise to the level of impeachment? And the second charge, especially saying there was obstruction of justice. Many presidents have had people not testify before Congress, and the courts should decide ultimately. We didn't even have the courts have time to decide. Watergate, as egregious as it was, as right laid out there, bare bones as it was, the Nixon administration officials were involved, even from the point after the Nixon re-election when we knew in early '73 that White House officials are involved, that still took a long time to play out. This was rushed for partisan circumstances. With Mr. Brindisi, the problem with the vote is not so much Trump, impeachment, it's the fact that he went on a very bad vote with the party leadership. And if he does it on this, he's going to do it in the future on things. For those voters in the district who say, I don't want a government takeover of health care, when Mr. Brindisi is pushed in the future, if he's still in office by Ms. Pelosi, he'll go with it. He went for the $3 trillion new stimulus that most people say, wow, this is over the top. We've already had several stimulus bills. We've already had a lot of stimulus. Now we have a $3 trillion stimulus. I think on any tough vote, he's going to go with the Pelosi liberal majority, and that's the underlying message here in the impeachment vote.
My follow-up would be, what do you think was Claudia Tenney's biggest mistake in Congress?
I think Tenney's biggest mistake, as told for me by the voters, is not representing her constituents in terms of not getting around and doing town hall meetings. I've obviously taken exception as well to her voting record. This is a Republican primary. Republican primary voters tend to be more conservative. Some of her votes are off the charts, whether it's Republican, Democrat, or Independent. Only real left-wing people people who are very liberal would agree with some of her votes. We had people who were in the military, joining the military, who are transgender, who, when they passed basic training, well documented, were saying, look, I'm under the insurance now, I want transgender therapies. Very clear evidence was documented. The only reason they were in the military was to get those surgeries. Claudia Tenney was one of the only Republicans to vote in favor of that. Claudia Tenney joined a climate change caucus, which I disagree with, and then she voted to make the Department of Defense study climate change. Again, I think 80% of voters to 90% of voters would disagree with her in the district, not just Republican primary voters, on those votes. That led her to have an American Conservative Union career rating of an F, 63%, one of the lowest in all Congress. So one, not representing her constituents. Two, her voting record, which a lot of people don't know about, but they're uncovering here in the waning days of this campaign.
If I could end this, why did you disagree with her voting to fund climate change research?
Yeah, so climate change caucus, obviously there's a lot of climate change research going on. The voting question that I called up was making the Department of Defense study climate change as a national security threat. And I disagree with that. If the EPA is going to do a study on it, that's one thing. But the Department of Defense shouldn't be financing transgender military surgeries and climate change studies for the Department of Defense, for the military. That's not a national security threat. Here, the Department of Defense money, if I'm in Congress, I'm going to make sure every vote for the Department of Defense is going to defend the United States of America and support the men and women who serve in the military, not going to climate change studies or some of these liberal agenda items like transgender military surgeries.
A similar question from a voter in Cortland County. If Claudia gets the Republican nomination next Tuesday, will you support and endorse her publicly to help unseat Anthony Brindisi?
Sure, I'll support her, but as I said before, I don't think she could win. We've talked to voters around here. I can't tell you how many Republicans say they don't like Tenney, they don't like the job she's done. They voted for Brindisi last time. They're going to vote for him again, unless I'm the nominee, and they may consider voting for me. Brindisi has worked hard. He has covered the district. That cuts into her biggest flaw of not covering the district. I don't think people are going to believe that she's all of a sudden going to show up 2 years from now and be very accessible when she hasn't been, and she won't even debate in this circumstance. I also want to note that there's so many absentee ballots out there. We think that 50% or more of the votes may be via absentee, so I don't think we're going to know on election night. Even if it's 1,000 or more, or 2,000 or 3,000 votes or more one way or another for either of the candidates, wait till those absentees are counted and let's see. So I'm looking at July 1st, the absentees start getting counted, and then sometime after that, we'll know who's successful here.
Absolutely. Let's talk now about the killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis.
Yes.
Have you seen that video?
Absolutely tragic and horrific.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, kind of on a deeper level, what did you think when you watched that video of George Floyd?
Yeah, just heartbreaking. What was the officer thinking? What were the other officers thinking around? It was egregious. I know George Floyd didn't have a chance to have his day in court about the charges against him. These officers do, but it's hard to imagine, just from what we've seen as the American public, a slam dunk case against the officers on some type of murder, depending on what degree it was, or others standing by, and it's very tragic. With that said, I believe, and I know in my heart, that the majority of police officers are not racist. They're putting their lives on the line every day. They are heroes, and they're taking risks every day. I look at police officers through the eyes of 3 students I taught whose father was murdered in the line of duty. I look at the police through the eyes of my 2 young boys who, whenever they see a police officer, their eyes lit up and they think, wow, this is a hero. They are our heroes, and I want to thank them for putting their lives on the line. And I'm a teacher. There's some teachers who have done egregious things and been fired from school. Not all teachers are bad. I'd say the same thing with police right now, and we have to get to the heart of the problem here. And I would say I'm someone who, my senior thesis in college, I wrote on civil rights legislation. A great book for readers that will just bring you to tears is Harvard Sitkoff's The Struggle for Black Equality. I've read about inner city situations. I taught in inner city DC public schools. There was not one student in our entire school, 1,500 students, who was not African American. I taught in a maximum security youth detention facility. The majority of the students were African American. I've worked for the Jack Kemp Foundation. His dream was to bring racial harmony together, to have a revitalization of our cities, to make sure every American could live that American dream. With all my experience, at the end of the day, I can't know what it's like still to be African American and the frustration they're having, and how do we get at the heart of it. I still think we need to get to the economic issues. As a member of Congress, I want to get to those, and I do think we had, and when I taught in DC public schools, you'd walk out and see the remnants of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Over 50 years ago, Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty. And it was well-intentioned, but so many of these government programs, rather than helping people, they became and led to dependency. We've had generations on poverty. We've had a breakdown of the family. We've had drugs. We have so many other dynamics in here. We need to, as a nation, come together and say, what are we going to do to revitalize our inner cities? One thing that I believe strongly and that I disagree with Claudia Tenney on is we need welfare to work. There was a clear vote that she had. It was called the McClintock Amendment on the Farm Bill, strengthening work requirements for food stamp recipients. She was one of the only Republicans to vote no on it. There is dignity in work. Even if it's a single mother with children at home, I think we need some type of work requirements. And in the modeling behavior we saw in the 1996 welfare reform bill, which has been whittled away and whittled away and whittled away, single mothers who were working were modeling incredible behavior for their kids. And I saw that in DC public schools. Unfortunately, so many of the boys weren't doing well. They were in gangs, they were in drugs, they weren't going to class. And I know there's a whole bunch of dynamics there, but sociologists would say statistically, a lot of times they didn't have good role models. Many of their fathers weren't at home. So many of these stories had heroic single moms caring for the family. And in class some days in DC public schools, I had only girl students there. The boys were skipping class, and again, it's not there's not great boys in DC public schools. It's not there's not girls not doing the right thing, but we need those role models. There's dignity in work. And I think we have to look at rescoring the earned income credit as well, which says if you're working and you're poor, you're eligible for tax credits, and it goes all the way up to $70,000, which the median family income is only in the $40,000 range in this congressional district. So for families, it's really scored towards families with kids. If you're a single person working, you may not get as much of an earned income credit. Let's look at that. That's a way I think Republicans and Democrats can come together. Let's look at jobs. Let's look at the economy. If we could see a revitalization of our cities, then I think we could see positive things. Also with the Kemp Foundation, even though I didn't work on this project, Jimmy Kemp, Jack Kemp's son, has been having forums years ago when unrest broke out, saying, let's bring police together and a community. Let's have forums, let's have discussions, let's have basketball games, let's build this trust. The old days here in Utica and other cities around the country, you would have had, the whole thing would be, instead of police, cops walking the beat. You'd have kids walking around, playing, riding their bikes, police officers there, just keep an eye on things, get to know everyone in the neighborhood. What an amazing experience here, where you had that respect between communities. We have to do that in our inner cities here. We have to come back. And obviously an issue that's just tearing our country apart right now. Our hearts are torn apart. We're very sad for George Floyd, and we've got to clean this up here, and hopefully we can be positive going forward.
And talking about that kind of community togetherness, here in Utica we saw hundreds of people marching in Oneida Square with Utica PD officers joining them. Would you have joined in on that march?
Yeah, I don't know if I would have joined in the march, but I do respect First Amendment rights. And one of my favorite topics outside of politics is marriage and the family. I've read so many books on marriage. My wife and I have gone on family marriage retreats. And someone told me something very important for the listeners who are married out there and others, that emotions are not a good or bad thing. If you're angry, if you're upset, if you're jealous, that's not good or bad. It's what you do with it. So people who are frustrated right now about George Floyd and the racial situations in our country, if they're speaking out in a positive, peaceful way, that's certainly positive. The rioting, obviously, we all condemn, and that's a small minority as well. But I think we have to look at that point that I learned in Marriage Encounter, and if there is the feelings there, we got to deal with it. So the fact that so many people, 50 years after the death of Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech, more than 50 years after that, still don't feel like they have an equal chance in America, that's very sad. And we have to address that. And again, I think the economic issues will help us a lot if we do that. There's other angles as well, certainly, that we have to address.
A voter in Broome County, kind of on that, you said that if people feel that they're still not equal. A voter in Broome County just kind of directly said, do you believe that there is systematic racism in America?
Yeah, I don't believe there is. Most people I know are not racist. But
you don't think there's systemic racism in any parts of our society?
Yeah, my definition that I learned in college of racism is there's a majority class and they have power over a minority class and they're intentionally discriminating against them. What I would say is this, and I saw this from DC public schools, on the one side...
Does there have to be intention in that? Does there have to be an intention to be discriminatory?
Yeah, good point. Systematic, I don't think people are intentionally pushing racism at this point in our country. That's my belief. But I do believe it cuts both ways. If you
do you think that it's still there, though, even if it's not intentional?
Right.
In our systems?
I don't believe it is. I believe in America in my heart that everyone has an equal chance here still. I believe the challenge that we're facing, and it cuts both ways, and I'll take a different race in here, that some are saying Asian Americans are discriminated against in college practices now because their scores are the highest here, but they're not getting in on that same percentage level because colleges are saying, wow, we would have just, great colleges like Cornell, for example, we'd have majority Asian students if we just went by the numbers there. There's strength in diversity. A college may look and say, wow, this kid from inner city DC who grew up in a single parent family in a gang neighborhood, in the worst neighborhood in DC that I taught in, this kid brings something to Cornell that a regular kid from a regular suburban prep school may not. So we're admitting him in. I understand the ability to do that, but it kind of cuts both ways. I think the concern is that people who have done well in America, if you have connections, if you're, let's take a family, the Bush family. President George W. Bush made it to be president. The man has skills, the man worked hard, but all around, I laugh in 1978 when he ran for Congress reading the story, it's so hard to raise money. He was at a campaign school with other candidates, he said, I just mailed my mom and dad's Christmas card list and I had all of this money here. His grandpa had been a U.S. Senator, his grandpa I think had owned a baseball team, his father was head of the Republican National Committee, so we tend to, even 50 years out from civil rights, have more white people, Caucasian people, having those connections that set the way for them.
Isn't that systemic racism though? If it's disproportionately Caucasian families have connections?
I guess we're debating over terms. What is systematic racism? I don't think people are intentionally discriminating under that. Look, let's go back to sports for a minute. Is there systemic inequality in our society? I don't think it's about intention. I think it's about, is there inequality in our policing system, in our education system, in our housing systems, in our economic I don't believe there is, no. The education, I think the sad thing is, right now, and President Trump said this the other day, the civil rights issue is school choice. So right now, you live in the school district where you go to school. I taught in Louisiana as well in a volunteer program. We went from our school, which was mixed race but majority Caucasian, to poor towns that were 100% African American. And I walked into the gym when I was coaching basketball, and the other coach said, "Coach, you and I both know that segregation went out 40 years ago. It's still the way it is here because you go to the school you live by." And I do think those schools have, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, not only lack of funding, but become inferior. And I do believe strongly in school choice. I don't think it would be as relevant in our congressional district because there's not many private schools. Our public schools are good, but even there, the idea, and this would have to happen on the state level, if you had school choice between Utica and New Hartford public schools, imagine that.
Right.
And then all of a sudden New Hartford's competing and Utica schools are competing here, and I think that would just be amazing. A dynamic market of choice. The two markets that are the most inefficient in this society, the two areas of society that are most inefficient, are education and healthcare. Education right now, it's costing in New York State $21,000 to educate a student K through 12 education. College costs are out of control. The government has so much control over education. Healthcare, Medicaid and Medicare are very important programs, but when you get to 33% of the states on Medicaid, they're not reimbursing hospitals the same way. Part of the coronavirus crisis in New York City is we have so many Medicaid patients, a lot of hospitals were closing. They couldn't afford to stay open, so do we have hospital beds? Those two markets, we need more choices in them. And on the federal level for education, there's very limits to what we can do. 93% of funding for education is still happening on the state and local level. And what you see, though, I think, is if you had choice, I think it'd be one of the best things we could do for inner cities, for racial equality. And it's amazing. I happen to teach at a Catholic school. I've been in inner city public schools as well. I think about the fact that in Catholic schools in New York City, the late Cardinal O'Connor said when New York City was having overcrowding in public schools, he said, look, give us your lowest 10%. Give us your lowest performing students, your worst discipline problems. We'll take them into our Catholic schools and we'll reform them. Now, I don't know if he would have been able to. They didn't get those students. But the idea is, if we have diversity in schools, maybe Catholic school isn't the solution for one student. Maybe it's trade school. There's all sorts of things that we see in charter schools and the charter school movement. I think those are all positive, and we should have schools competing for the customers, for parents, for children. And I think that will help immensely inner city families and inner city schools.
I want to get to a few more voter questions before we run out of time.
Yes.
So a voter in Madison County asked a question I thought would be interesting given your background as a history teacher, someone who's looked at divided government like we have now in Washington. She writes, how would you utilize bipartisanship as a potential congressman working with a potential Biden administration?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually worked, I say this loosely because I disagree with Anthony Bernizzi saying that he worked with President Trump. I worked on a law on human trafficking that President Bush signed. You know, for me to say I worked with President Bush, that was a stretch. He never called the congressman I worked for on the law. He was never involved directly. If I debate Anthony Bernizzi, I'd like to ask him that. Did you actually talk with President Trump on veterans work and stuff that's very bipartisan? I worked on a law on human trafficking, very bipartisan. Bernizzi's worked on veterans work, very bipartisan. When we were working on the human trafficking law, I was actually on a conference call with Joe Biden, and this has been in the news because the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 was the Violence Against Women and Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The Violence Against Women Act was a Joe Biden bill in the Senate. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was a House bill from the congressman I was working for from New Jersey. So I was on a conference call on the follow bill on this, and I actually, he probably wouldn't remember this, but I shot him down on something he was proposing on our bill. So I was on a conference call. I talked to Senator Biden then. We also were at a press conference on something with Bono's group, Bono, the U2 singer, with Senator Biden on something in Africa that we're working on. So I actually can perhaps claim that I've worked with Senator Biden. More importantly, what we have to look at, besides these areas that are by nature bipartisan, I think everybody wants to get some type of police reform done. Democrats have their bill, Senator Scott and the Senate have theirs. Everyone wants to get veterans done. Everyone's against human trafficking. What about the big issues? The national debt, health care, welfare to work. I have plans that I think I could sell as bipartisan on all of those. On the national debt, I want every member of Congress to have to scour for waste on the right and left and come up with 10 ways to cut waste in the budget. That's bipartisan. That's a big controversial issue. Healthcare, I want more choices for all Americans. I want to model it through federal employees and say, look, you guys have great plans now, but remember, $10,000 to $15,000 that's being put in by the federal government for your federal plan, you're not seeing in salary. Would you like some more salary and have a more flexible plan? So I'm reaching out already to unions, which are Democrat, usually by nature. Welfare to work. Look, we got to get together on this. The left's talking about minimum wage increases. Those are job killers. The right is saying welfare to work. What I've floated on the earned income credit, that's a way to bring people together. We all want more Americans working, so I know I can get the job done. I'm going to challenge Anthony Brindisi's record. And Claudia Tenney, just by nature, most people don't think she's been able to work in a bipartisan fashion in her whole career. She's been too controversial. She hasn't thus far. I don't think she's going to be able to in the future.
Another question, kind of the flip side of the question I just asked you, from a voter in Broome County. They ask, do you have the proper connections to the Trump administration, given that he endorsed your primary?
Yeah, what I'm going to take in, not having connections in the Trump administration, is relentless energy, relentless drive. I've showed this as a congressional aide. I've showed this as a candidate. I've showed it as my work in Reclaim New York. I'll be absolutely relentless for the taxpayers of this district and for the people of this country at getting things done. The congressman I work for taught me an important lesson. He said the first rule is never accept no for an answer. We just have to keep going. So some of these programs that I'm pushing here, if the White House doesn't get back to me, I might just show up, when they're leaving the White House here, and there's a garage that's very secure. I may not be able to do that, but just absolutely relentless. A Senate staffer one time ran into me at a restaurant after hours, and he said, "You're absolutely relentless. We've never seen anyone like you. You're such a great advocate for your boss, for his legislation." That's what I'm going to be like for the people of Utica, for the Mohawk Valley, for this congressional district, and that's the type of representative you'll see in the United States Congress.
One last question here. We have a little bit more time from a voter in Oneida County. He asks you, what is one interaction you've had with a voter, obviously you haven't been able to do this as much lately, but that sticks out in your mind and drives you to be a public servant?
Yeah, one was, stands out to me quite frankly. It happened it's happened on a lot of doors here in the Utica area, in the Binghamton area, but just the stories I've heard from people on door to door, that has been incredibly memorable. There was one in Binghamton, and it was a family that's become famous. Their daughter was murdered on her paper route. And it happened years ago, and the guy is up for parole now, but she was a paper girl a few years before I was. So that's something that I'll just always take with me. I was actually at their house the same day the house was being torn down that she was murdered in after all these years. But overall here in the Mohawk Valley, I've had so many incredible experiences as well. One that stands out, to be completely honest, was a woman, I'm forgetting her name, but you notice if people are religious in their houses, they might have a crucifix up or a religious quote, and I made a comment on someone. They said, you should see the woman down the street. She was the woman who raised the cause for Marianne Cope. And Marianne Cope obviously is known to a lot of the Mohawk Valley watchers here. She's probably out of people that are associated with the United States and the American Catholic Church, she's one of only about a dozen saints. Right. Yeah. And her story is heroic. She left, she started a hospital, I believe, in Syracuse, but served and grew up here at St. Joe's and St. Joe's, I think it was at the time. Yeah, it's just an amazing story. And she never thought that she was going to be such a famous person. And I was here with this seemingly 90-year-old woman who was telling me about Marianne Cope. It turned out that this woman's ancestors, Marianne Cope's ancestors and mine, were all from the same part of Germany.
Oh, wow.
So that was really special. But it's the people and their stories that make it up. That's what it's all about. That's been my favorite part. And hearing from them, hearing their stories. A lot of the ideas I've come up with are things I've heard from the average people. They have the most common sense sometimes, many times, more than Washington politicians.
Absolutely. Mr. Phillips, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. We're doing we're doing this here. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. I hope to be on in the general election.